are the chairman of the Senate Fish, Game, and Forestry Committee, which is the committee where all of the fish game rules come through on the Senate side. And so you sort of get to pick and choose what bills get placed on the calendar, so to speak. You get to pick and choose what bills have subcommittees and full committees and get placed on the calendar. So you got an inordinate amount. Inordinate's not the right word. You've got the appropriate amount of power, but I was going to say a thumb on your on the ability to change things in Columbia, in South Carolina for wildlife, and you do a dang good job of it. I mean, I didn't want to give the impression that you're the guy that can stop anything or start anything, but the truth is you are. I mean, you are essentially the firewall for all hunting and fishing rules and even regs in South Carolina, and you do a darn good job of it. We have seen some issues with wildlife in the past, and you and I both have taken up the fight and tried to come up with commonsensical, hunter-friendly, but also conservation-minded approaches to dealing with these issues that we see, for instance, with turkeys. And didn't we just now take up one last week with red snapper? And you and I introduced a bill, and this particular bill, I'll sort of brief everybody on what it does, and then I'd like your opinion because you are a huge offshore fisherman. But this particular bill addresses our problem with red snapper, and if you haven't been following red snapper, folks, that's something you need to pay attention to because it is sort of like the canary in the coal mine for fishing regulations, fishing rules, especially federal fisheries rules. Red snapper was closed in 2007 or 8, and the federal government determined that there had been overfishing and that the population was overfished. And maybe it was. I'm not disputing that it was or it wasn't. But we have come so far, full circle, that now you can't catch a fish, a red snapper, because literally the federal government tells us we are catching too many and there's too much bycatch. Y'all, if that is not a failure of fishing, I cannot even describe to you how much of a failure I find that to be, and yet it's still closed. So what did Senator Campsen and I do this week? We introduced a bill that will open red snapper season in state waters. Why did we do that? Because you and I, Captain E, know somebody that actually caught a red snapper at the jetty.
Jetties, yep.
At the jetty rock, which is not traditionally where they have been. I actually see that sort of like an invasive species. You know, when they start eating our inshore reefs out of house and home, as they've done with the offshore reefs, we're in trouble. And Senator Campsen has been squarely behind that effort too. Talk to me about some offshore fishing. Have you seen? I know you do a lot of bill fishing. Do you do any bottom fishing at all when you're on your way in?
I don't do a lot of bottom fishing. You're a much more experienced bottom fishing than me. I do it periodically. I've started actually bottom fishing for swordfish during the daytime. We've just kind of figured out how to do that here in the last few years. We used to always just fish for them at night, but also we'll catch some tile fish and things like that because you're really deep dropping when you're fishing for them. But of course, as an offshore fisherman, I prefer to troll, but when the trolling slows down and like in August, and that can happen, or July and August, and we'll drop to the bottom and catch some bottom fish. But I'm not near as accomplished as you, but I do know this, that basically we're having to throw a lot of red snapper back, a lot of dead ones too, if you're fishing deep and you don't vent their air bladder properly, which a lot of people, even experienced people, often don't do it properly. Throwing dead red snapper back just to catch a grouper, right. 10 dead red snapper for every grouper, or 20 dead red snapper, and it's because they're throwing it back because you can't keep them. There's like Last year there was a 2-day season, or 2 or 3 was what
and
it was.
And it was windy.
3, and it blew
Yeah,
every day. Yep.
yeah. And so we're doing what we can. I mean, we don't have jurisdiction in South Carolina beyond 3 miles offshore. A lot of folks think no red snapper ever caught within that 3 mile zone, and certainly it's rare, but it does happen. So at least what we're doing in the area of jurisdiction that we control as a state, you and I are allowing anglers to keep to red snapper, and 20-inch. I think it's a 20-inch.
It is
length limit, and in the subcommittee hearing we had on Wednesday, we had some testimony from the South Atlantic Fisheries Council representatives from South Carolina that they know the red snapper are coming back, and I asked him, well, why don't we have a season then? And he said, well, because he says we're heading in that direction. Of course, we've been hearing that for years, heading in that direction. But a lot of these fish are juvenile fish, and they're slow growers, and we want the stock to get more. I guess the median age of the stock to get older, so that there's more spawning activity before they open it back up. That was what the response.
So you and I have talked about.
I'm not saying I embrace that, but
No,
that's their strategy. That's what they're doing.
So you and I have talked about this in the past, but for the benefit of the listeners, I'll go through a little bit of this history. So there is different branches of NOAA, which ultimately controls the SAFMC, the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council, SAFMC. NOAA has a branch in Beaufort, North Carolina, and they have a branch in Miami, Florida. The branch in Beaufort uses a sampling technique for their models for red snapper called Chevron Traps. If you've never seen a Chevron trap, it's a glorified giant crab trap looking thing, or a sea bass trap. Okay, if you can imagine, on a Chevron trap, the opening of a Chevron trap is maybe 8 inches across, and I mean diameter wise, it's not. I mean, I could fit my arm in it. Okay. In Miami, they use a hook and line captain's choice sampling model. In the South Atlantic, which is where the Beaufort NOAA uses that Chevron trap model, in the South Atlantic, they continually find that the fish they catch in these Chevron traps, the red snapper they catch in these Chevron traps, are juveniles. And they can't seem to understand why they won't get a 30-pound female breeding red snapper in a crab trap, in a glorified crab trap. Now, Miami, who uses hook and line captain's choice model, they catch all kinds of grown red snapper. And guess what? Miami controls the Gulf section. The Gulf has a snapper season now.
Well, I didn't know that distinction. I wish you'd have been at the subcommittee meeting yesterday to challenge that statement he made. I wasn't aware of the different gear being used. Of course, you had an excuse because
he's been under the weather.
I bet you can
under the weather.
Probably tell by my voice it's a little weak. I've had the flu, but I'm doing much better. Tamiflu's been amazing for me. But yeah, I mean, that just goes to show you the problems we have with the current system are more than just people problems. They're more than just personalities. It is truly a much more in-depth problem than that, and it's going to require a lot of people coming together to solve this. And you and I mean, like you said, we don't have the jurisdiction to go out and say, okay, you can catch all the red snapper you want, beyond 3 miles. But the only thing we can control is when a red snapper comes into our state waters, we're going to darn well make sure that our people can catch them and get them out of the state waters. Because if you haven't noticed lately, if you do a lot of bottom fishing, if you haven't noticed lately, I don't know, go back 10 years, Captain E.
Yep.
How would you say, and I hate to put you on the spot, but how would you say 10 years ago the black sea bass population?
Black sea bass were, we were completely.
Inundated.
I mean, it's got. All I'm gonna say is right now the way we're sitting here talking about red snapper, we were talking about black sea bass.
Yeah.
We're talking. We were into 3 or 4 years of that big change with sea bass dropping the bag limit, everything else. And everywhere you went, it was black sea bass, black sea bass, black sea bass. And everything from 4 inches to, 2-3 pounders. And then now, all of a sudden, the red snapper are just like that. Yeah, you can catch black sea bass right now. You can actually catch them near shore on those good live bottoms in 45, 50 foot of water. But back when they should have been there in the fall, everybody in that near shore water was catching red snapper everywhere you went. And it's been insane. And I know where you're going with this because you and I have talked about this countless times on my radio show and everything else. But I don't know that the red snapper now aren't completely decimating the black sea bass.
I think that's exactly what's happening.
I do.
So I do a lot
I've heard many anglers say that they think it's happening.
Yeah, I do a lot. Both of y'all know I do a lot of offshore spearfishing, and so I get to sort of see it with my own eyes. And there are many times you will drop onto a piece of hard bottom or even onto a wreck, and you'll see over 100 full-grown red snapper, mature red snapper. 10 years ago, you'd drop on these same spots in the fall and in the wintertime, and there'd be thousands of black sea bass. Thousands of them. They are gone. They are gone. And they've been replaced with red snapper because they eat everything. They decimate a site. They eat everything. And every single year, they've been moving in a little closer and a little closer and a little closer. And then this year, we start seeing people catching them at the 3 mile and at the jetty. To me, that is a threat to our inshore species. That's a threat to sheepshead. That's a threat to spadefish. That's a threat to everything that grows up on an inshore reef or wreck. They eat everything. And the federal government is just letting it happen. Just letting it happen. Now, Chip, I have dominated this conversation a little bit.
I know. I was wondering, hey, I was going to be like, Chip, do you have to deal with this every day in the State House? Because good Lord.
I'm used to it. Yeah, I'm used to it.
I'm sorry. Red snapper, as you know, is a soapbox.
But he usually knows what he's talking about. I don't often admit that.
Well,
since he put me under oath, I'll admit it.
Ditto to you, by the way. Captain E, without giving Chip too much of a big head, he is probably one of the most intellectually stimulating people to talk to on a lot of different issues, not just hunting and fishing and conservation issues, but get him started on federalism, the 10th Amendment, Edmund Burke, and it's just a fascinating repertoire of knowledge, like a dossier that he goes through in his head of how he comes up with arguments, and it's really fascinating to me. And what I find that, Chip, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think what drives you. Well, let me just ask you. I don't want to pretend to know what. How do you start an argument? What is it what is your starting point on an argument on anything from medical marijuana that we're talking about now to certificate of need to, talking about red snapper. When you start an argument, do you start off with federalism? Do you start off with the Federalist Papers? Do you start off with a quote in your head that this is my guiding principle? How do you start an argument? Because you are very persuasive in the way you argue.
Well, I would say that the starting point is more organic than the Federalist Papers or the Constitution, although the organic principle, when I say organic, I mean more basic, more fundamental. The primary presupposition that you're operating from, it's more basic than those documents, but this same presupposition is very well reflected in those documents, and well articulated by Edmund Burke, who I would encourage everyone. This isn't about hunting and fishing or conservation, but I would encourage everyone to read The Great Debate by Yuval Levin. If you want to understand the basic foundation or reasons for the political divide we experience today. It's the same divide that